With only 75 vehicles, the Swedish tank tech tree is one of the smallest in War Thunder, beating out only Israel and Italy. However, this situation used to be much worse, with Sweden's tech tree until recently only numbering around 57 Swedish tanks, and in the end this was rectified only by the addition of Finland as a subtree. But despite the large increase in available tanks, there are still many Swedish tanks that still need adding to War Thunder, some of which we will be looking at today. Now, the first vehicle we're going to be looking at is the STRV M40K, which is a variant of the STRV M40L. Now, of course, what is the 40K? Well, in the grim darkness of the 41st year of the 20th century, Europe only knew war. And as such, Sweden decided it should probably produce some more tanks. Now, it should be remembered when producing tanks, the Swedish did like to build them in batches. So the production of the L60 tank variants was done in 4 batches. The first as the STRV M38, the second as the STRV M39, the third as the STRV M40L, and then of course we come to the M40K. And the M40K was very similar to the M40L, with the K designation being used to differentiate the two designs, and the K standing for Karlstad Mechanische Werkstad, which was the company that was chosen to produce the new tank. Now, on the face of it, these two tanks were very similar to each other, but there are some noticeable differences between the L and K variants. The first big difference is regards to the armour, as on the 40L, the frontal hull armour was only 13mm thick, but there were attachment points so that 30mm applique armour plates could be installed, with the idea being that the tanks could operate without the armour in peacetime, putting less strain on the engine and suspension, and then during times of war the extra armour could be fitted, allowing the Swedes to have the best of both worlds in peacetime and wartime. However, on the 40K, this approach was entirely disregarded, and the frontal hull was now produced as a single 50mm armour plate. In real life, this is the superior approach to protection, as 2 plates combined are less effective than one equivalent plate of the same thickness. In-game, however, I don't believe this is actually the case, so this probably won't be a huge gameplay difference. But in addition to the frontal armour, the side armour is slightly increased from 13mm to 18mm, so at least for the side armour there is some improvement. To offset the increase in weight from all this additional armour, the 40K was fitted with a new 160 horsepower Scania Vabis engine, compared to the 142 horsepower engine of the 40L, though this doesn't seem to have greatly affected the max speed, which should remain around 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, which is still a pretty decent speed for this tank. Due to these upgrades, the 40K was also slightly larger than the 40L, being 4.97 metres long, 2.8 metres wide and 2.12 metres tall, compared to the 40L's 4.9 metres long, 2.7 metres wide and 2.05 metres tall. So not a drastic difference, and so it is unlikely to have any major effects in the game, but of course it is something to bear in mind. Despite all the other changes, the armament remains the same as the 40L, being fitted with the same 37mm gun, given a penetration of 37mm at 500 metres with APHE, or 95mm with APDS, because that's just a thing that Sweden gets at Tier 1 for some reason. In addition to this, it also has the 2 M39 7.62mm coaxial machine guns. When added to War Thunder, I would suggest foldering the 40K with the existing 40L, as these are on the face of it very similar tanks. An argument could be made for making this an event or battle pass tank, which I think could be a good compromise, though I would prefer having it as a regular tank. It would also have the same battle rating as the 40L at 2.0, because as I've said before, they are very similar tanks, though in theory you could potentially put it to 2.3 and it would still manage there, but like I say, I'd suggest putting it at 2.0. As for how it would play in War Thunder, I suspect it would play almost identically to the 40L, though of course due to being slightly larger it could in theory be easier to spot, though again I don't think this is really going to be much of an issue in game. Overall, it would be nice to see the 40K added to Sweden, as this was a major tank in Swedish service, and it would be good to see all the major types of tanks represented in Sweden's tank tech tree. Now for the next tank, I wasn't really sure whether to cover it, as it is an interwar period tank that is right on the edge of what I would deem acceptable for War Thunder. However, after some thought, I think there is a way that it could still be added for reasons I will explain at the end of this entry. The tank in question is the STRV M2129, which was originally a German tank that was adopted and modified by Sweden in the interwar period. Originally known as the Leichter Kampfwagen II or LK2, this tank was originally developed during World War I as a light tank for the German army, with 2 prototypes finished in June 1918, which was followed by an order for 580 LK2s. However, these were not finished by the end of World War I, and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles prohibited the German army from possessing any tanks. However, that's not to say that the Germans didn't try to circumvent the treaty, and it seems that parts for a number of these tanks were hidden from the Allies. At some point, Sweden seems to have found out about these unassembled tanks, as they subsequently brought enough parts to construct 10 of these tanks, with the parts being secreted to Sweden where they were assembled. The assembly was done by the AB Landsverk company, and these were given the designation of Stridsvagn M21, or STRV M21 for short. At first, these were only armed with machine guns, but in 1929 a 37mm gun, new engine and new gearbox was added to 5 of these tanks, leading to their redesignation as the STRV M21-29. Unfortunately, there are virtually no pictures of this tank in the 37mm gun configuration, hence the pictures used are all of the earlier versions armed only with the machine guns. Now unfortunately there seems to be very little information on the 37mm gun. I know at least one was tested with the 37mm gun that was used on the FCM36, but the M2129s in service used a different 37mm gun. Information on what gun this actually was is, like I say, almost non-existent, with a few sources suggesting it was possibly a Skoda gun, maybe even an infantry support gun like with the French 37mm gun, but the likely candidates were, as I understand, produced after 1929, though I've been unable to confirm which exact type. This has also understandably meant that it's very hard to find solid penetration figures. I had seen one online source which suggested about 22mm at 500 metres, but I'm not sure what source they were quoting from. Though hopefully it would be around this ballpark, which does seem in keeping with some other guns of this type and would make it somewhat competitive in the lower tiers, though like I say this would need further research. As can be expected from a light tank from the World War I period, the armour on the M2129 is very thin, being a maximum of 14mm, though there is some sloping which does help to maximise the armour. It also had lots of rivets and bolts, which as many of you know does cause additional issues from spalling even in the event of a non-penetrating hit. The max speed is 18 km an hour or 11 miles per hour on an 85 horsepower Scania Vabis engine, which is a major disadvantage as this would be much slower than most other tanks in Tier 1, but not so drastically slow as to be useless. The crew complement is somewhat difficult to determine, as while the original crew was 2 with a driver and commander, in Swedish service this could potentially reach up to 4, primarily to man the extra machine guns in the turret. However, some sources say that these machine guns were removed when fitted with the 37mm gun, so it is possible it would just be the driver in the hull and the commander in the turret. If added to War Thunder under the current standards, the M2129 would be a 1.0 reserve tier tank, possibly replacing the STRV M31, as the M31 is a much more modern tank. However, I believe there is an alternative way of adding this and similar tanks, and that would be to introduce this and other interwar or World War I era tanks at below 1.0. For example, the M2129 could be a 0.3 or 0.7 tank, which would be a way to introduce World War I tanks to the game without making them completely outclassed by everything else, as well as allowing them to fight each other with little interference from the more modern tanks. If added at 0.3 to 0.7, I think this would be a decent tank, especially against other interwar or World War I tanks, and would even potentially be able to stand against some 1.0 tanks. Of course, this tank wouldn't be a huge priority for adding to War Thunder, but I think it would be a fun tank to use nonetheless, and I would like to see this and other early tanks added to War Thunder in this fashion. Lastly, we have the L180, or P-Bill M41 in Swedish service. And this was a Swedish armoured car that was widely exported in many different variations to many foreign nations. Indeed, if you've watched my video on Danish and Dutch vehicles that should be added to War Thunder, you will see we've already covered this in some of the variants that those two nations used. Ironically, despite being produced in Sweden by the AB Landsverk company, these armoured cars were never actually ordered by Sweden. So how did Sweden end up using 5 of these vehicles? Well, they were originally ordered by Ireland, who was already using some of these armoured cars, and so an order for 5 more was made, and 1/3 of the purchase price was paid up front. However, with the outbreak of war and AB Landsverk being sanctioned by Britain due to it still trading with Germany, it was almost impossible for Ireland to actually pay the remaining balance, or even to actually receive these 5 L180s. As such, they were transferred to the Swedish Army, and Ireland received a refund plus interest on the already paid balance at the end of the war. Once in Swedish service, they were put into service as the Panzerbill M41, or P-Bill M41 for short. The L180s in Swedish service were armed with the 20mm Bofors ACAN M40, the same gun as used on the P-Bill M40 already in game. This gives a penetration of 30mm at 500 metres with APT shells, a respectable amount for the low tiers. In addition to this, it also had 2 8mm KSP M36 machine guns, one in a coaxial position and one mounted at the rear and operated by the rear driver. Armour as to be expected is light, maxing out at 9mm for the turret and 7mm for the hull, though this is somewhat helped due to the use of sloping. As an armoured car, it can be expected to be pretty quick on flat terrain, having a top speed of 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour, making this a pretty fast vehicle on roads. Though of course speed will suffer when going cross-country, which of course can be an issue on some maps. The crew complement of the L180 is 5, consisting of a driver and rear driver in the hull, and a commander, loader and gunner in the turret, making this a well-crewed vehicle able to sustain some casualties without causing too many difficulties to continued operations. So where would the P-Bill M41 go in War Thunder? I would suggest placing it at a battle rating of 1.7 like with its P-Bill M39 counterpart. And while I would like to see it in the regular tech tree, there isn't really an obvious spot it could go in. Perhaps it could go somewhere on the Swedish anti-air lineup, maybe before or after the PV LVV FM42, much like with the German SDKFZ 222 in its tech tree. Overall, I think this would be a good recon vehicle for the lower tiers, able to quickly get into position, unleash a barrage of fire from its fast-firing autocannon, before quickly escaping to a new position, where it can try and repeat the process. And it would be nice for one of Sweden's most produced armoured cars to be in War Thunder in some fashion. So that's all the Swedish vehicles for this week's episode. I'd be interested to hear your views on these vehicles, and if there are any other Swedish vehicles you would like me to cover. I'll be looking forward to reading your comments below. So that's it for today's episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and will join me for future episodes. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.